The diagnosis. It was 2001. Apple introduced iTunes. Wikipedia went online, and the first map of the human genome was published in Nature. And in our family, that year got off to an exciting start. Our life was full of possibilities. A family growing up in a rapidly changing world with more travel and communication than ever before. Computers were in the home. Whatever was next? I was busy. Working full-time and rearing 4 children kept me from boredom. At 22, John was going to college in the nearby town of Tralee, and he came home for the weekends. Paul, who was 19 and happy working, had a lovely girlfriend, Valerie, who brought fun and joy into all our lives. He'd bought himself a car, so he was becoming independent. My 18-year-old, Brian, was studying hard. He wanted to gain entrance to the local university and had exams coming up in the summer. Vicky, who was 16, was also busy studying. It was such a lively household, with music blaring. The lads had a set of decks they loved to listen to, and they made some original mixes, mostly of trance music. Living in Ireland, where almost a third of the population was aged 19 or younger, we felt part of the life and vitality that surrounded us. The washing machine was constantly on the go, as the boys played in the local soccer and football teams. Vicky had her dance and drama classes as well as horse riding, so life was full on, with working, shopping, keeping everyone fed and the general upkeep of house and home. There wasn't a lot of time to sweat the small stuff. I was kept going. You know how it is. On to the next thing, with the list growing regardless of each job done. One morning towards the end of February, Brian called out to me, clutching his chest. "Mum, I've got a pain," he panted, gasping for breath. I realised something was seriously wrong with my normally healthy son. "Why didn't you call me earlier, Brian?" I asked, worried. "I didn't want to wake you, Mummy," he replied. Brian never made a fuss of himself. He took life as it came. 6 foot tall, dark-haired, his brown eyes always dancing with mischief. I thought him so handsome, though I know I'm really terribly biased. I was so concerned I phoned Dr. Joe Dillon, our family doctor. Dr. Dillon arrived at our home shortly afterwards and quickly told us to stop at the nearby pharmacy for aspirin before bringing Brian straight to the hospital. I was shocked that hospital tests were the immediate reaction from our doctor. I quickly tried to get Brian to the hospital without allowing myself to think too much. We got the aspirin and a drink of water in the pharmacy and went straight to Cork University Hospital nearby. I was frightened, as I guessed the doctor was seriously concerned about Brian's heart. We didn't say anything openly that might have been frightening to Brian or might have exasperated his condition. We were seen to more or less straight away, and when the ECG showed no problems, I began to breathe a sigh of relief. Well, at least if it's not his heart, I thought, we've a chance to sort things out. I hoped there wasn't anything too serious, perhaps a collapsed lung or something like that. However, the x-rays and blood tests showed nothing unusual. The pain eased, and Brian was discharged at 4:30 p.m. No problem was found. The doctors didn't know what was wrong. I was sure all would be well, and this pain would never return. What a relief, even though there was a question nagging away in the back of my mind. Over the coming 2 weeks, however, Brian's pain returned often, in different locations in his body. I sent a note to Brian's school which read, "If he gets a pain, please let him go home at once and call a taxi if necessary. He's not crying wolf." Brian didn't bother with a taxi, but he did call in to me at work one day. He dropped off his school bag and then got the bus home. Independent and undemanding, he insisted he'd be okay on the bus. His pains came more frequently. As he was gasping for breath, his body would visibly tremble. He stayed home from school, and his dad, John, checked on him every lunch hour. Dr. Dillon organised a number of blood tests. Day after day, nothing showed up. We were very confused and surprised that we did not have a diagnosis. But we were optimistic that the illness would just wear itself out and Brian would get better. Dr. Dillon probed further when there wasn't a diagnosis of a physical illness. He questioned whether or not Brian had problems at school or was experiencing exam pressure. No, the pain is real, I insisted. That finished that discussion, because my doctor believes mothers. He just had to check all the possibilities. John and I were so concerned that John took a week's holiday from work to be with Brian, feeling he needed the care of a parent. Plans had previously been made for Paul, Brian, their dad and Jerry Hurley, a family friend, to go to a soccer international in Dublin between Ireland and Denmark on Wednesday, February 28th. However, Brian could not get out of bed that day. As it happened, the match was cancelled because the Lansdowne Road terraces were covered with ice and snow. We were grateful that the match had to be rescheduled. Brian didn't feel he had missed out on anything. He went into town to a record shop with his dad another day that same week. But he had to sit on the windowsill outside. He needed to rest due to the excruciating pain in his back and legs. With no improvement in Brian's pain level and no obvious cause for his pain, Dr. Dillon made an appointment for him to see a haematologist in the local hospital. I just knew in my gut that Brian was really suffering. 2 weeks after that first pain in his chest, Brian had more blood tests. Dr. Paula Cotter, the haematologist, said that she hoped Brian had a virus. Or perhaps it was glandular fever or Weil's disease. As yet, nothing unusual showed up. Tests continued every day on an outpatient basis. Yet no new information came to light. Brian was quite disabled by pain at this stage. He was losing power in his pain-racked hands, and his legs could not hold him up. He was unable to eat anything. I didn't know what to think or feel. I was mostly numb. Brian seemed so very ill, and yet I could do nothing. I had no idea what was wrong with him or how to help. When would this pain go away? Paul, our second son, came home from work one Tuesday very upset. His growing fear revealed in his dark eyes. My friend David's 14-year-old niece Melissa has all the same pains as Brian, he sobbed to his dad. Now they've found out she has leukemia. Paul is a very determined young man. His tears were a very uncommon sight. His dad tried to console him. Paul, if Brian had leukemia, they would have seen that straight away. I agreed with my husband John. I was beginning to think that Brian must have some strange genetic disease, something rare, that didn't show up in ordinary tests. But then I was no doctor. John phoned the consultant every day for results, and phoned me at work with the same news every day. No definite cause was discovered for the pain. Day after day, for 2 weeks, we got the same answer. Then the blood test began to show some increase in white blood cells, which could mean infection. Brian was admitted to hospital. By now, it was mid-March. At this stage, Brian's pain was intense and pretty constant. He couldn't lift his head off the pillow. He used a straw to take a drink. His body was twisted and racked with pain. Brian's friends were incredible, though. Mobile phones were relatively new at the time, and his friends kept in constant contact. They chatted away to him like normal and made no big deal of his growing disabilities. In hospital, when he couldn't walk, they grabbed a wheelchair and took him for races up and down the corridor, like it was the greatest fun. They wanted to make light of the fact that Brian couldn't walk anymore. A lumbar puncture was organised for the Wednesday. At work that day, I got my usual phone call from John with the consultant's test results. "I'm afraid I've got bad news," he said. "Brian has leukemia." It was 2:30 in the afternoon. That was the time my world stopped turning. The good news is that he has an 85% chance of survival. He's young, has no health problems. He has every chance. John's voice was matter-of-fact as he tried desperately to make this news sound more acceptable. I'd secretly nurtured a hope that the symptoms would amount to nothing, that Brian would just get better. This dream was now dashed, replaced with a statistical outcome. Dr. Cotter had phoned John asking him to call in to see her. He had decided he would find out the detail first before worrying me, so he filled me in. Because of the chemo, Brian would be completely open to infection. He was being moved to an isolation ward and would start chemo immediately. He would, hopefully, be better in 6 months. But in the meantime, he'd have to stay out of pubs and discos, etc., away from any place where there were lots of people, exposing him to a high risk of infection. "What's the bad news?" I quietly inquired. "If they don't cure it, he won't be with us this time next year." The world stopped when I heard those words. I put the phone down and tried to arrange my thoughts. What did I know about leukemia? Nothing, except that a man across the street had died from it about 10 years before, but I didn't know the details. I don't even remember hearing that he had pains like Brian. Anyway, John said something about 4 types and that Brian's type had a big success rate. I assumed that Brian, being young and otherwise healthy, would be in the 85% group. There was every reason that he would. No reason at all why he wouldn't. Oh my God, Brian was such a social butterfly. How would he cope with staying out of groups? How was I going to help him deal with the isolation he would have to endure for the summer? How could I even get across to him that this was actually important? My head was spinning. I felt I was a stranger in a strange land. Why did this happen to Brian of all people? He was such a nice kid. He loved life, loved his friends, and was such fun to be with. Immediately, word spread at work about Brian. My work colleagues were so concerned and caring. Ever since Brian had been admitted, I went in to see him in the hospital every day before work. His dad went in at lunchtime and I went in again at 5 p.m. until John, the children and friends came after dinner. My colleagues were urging me to go straight to the hospital, but initially I was afraid that I would alarm Brian. I wondered if he would remember our neighbour who had died of leukemia. Would he be fearful that he was going to die himself? Would he see my fear? Also, I was in a state of shock, and when I don't know what to do, I tend to freeze, to stand my ground just where I am. Half an hour had passed when my boss, Ray, appeared, his face white. He had just heard. "I look after this," he said. "Are you okay?" His kindness seemed to, somehow, increase my sense of panic. "I'd better head for the hospital, Ray." I wished he would say somehow that it was a false alarm, and I need not rush out to be with Brian. However, that consolation was not forthcoming. So reluctantly, I walked away from my desk. In the elevator on the way up to Brian, who did I bump into? Only David. I hadn't even noticed him. "You're Brian's mum, aren't you?" "How's Brian?" he said. "He's got leukemia," I replied, hearing myself speak the word out in public for the first time. Suddenly I remembered his niece, the girl with the leukemia. "And how's Melissa?" "She's had a brain hemorrhage and she's unconscious," he said as calmly as he could. His white face and clenched fists told me that he was holding back his emotions. Dear God! With those words ringing in my ears, I made my way to Brian. At that point, I did not understand why the hemorrhage had happened. I consoled myself that at least Brian only had leukemia. I don't really remember a lot about the doctor telling Brian he had leukemia. Only that Brian didn't really mind having a blood disorder, but he didn't want anyone to know he had leukemia. He didn't want to be the leukemia kid. He didn't want people feeling sorry for him, talking about him. I agreed to this just for the short term. The doctor explained to me that the chemo would start now, and Brian would probably be sterile as a result. There was no time to harvest seeds. This really upset me, as I'd always visualised my children having families of their own. Anyway, I'd tell him that later when he got better. There was time enough to face that cruel blow. The pain should be gone in a week, we were told. As his parents, John and I, were very distressed. But we were determined that the single most important thing now was our child's recovery, and that we'd put all our efforts and energy into supporting that. I was worried for the past while that Brian might have leukemia. John said to me, "There didn't seem to be any point in worrying you." But one day when I was at home minding him, he got a nosebleed when he was sitting on the couch watching TV. I kept it to myself. But it did worry me. I dismissed the thought. Any other option seemed more favourable to me. Now that he was diagnosed, Brian was written up for morphine injections for the pain. Being 18, he was technically an adult, so I didn't have any authority to make decisions on his behalf. I was really worried whether or not I should talk to him about the chemo making him sterile. Was he going to feel later on that I should have understood the implications and prevented such an outcome? I just didn't know. The doctor seemed to be in such a rush, not wanting to wait even a couple of hours. So I just let it go and hoped to God I was doing the right thing. We moved to the isolation ward 2D. I'd never been in an isolation ward before. Each patient has an individual outer room with a sink and a supply of sterile disposable gloves, masks, aprons and shoe covers. It's essential to be gowned up before going into the isolation room itself, so infection is not passed on to the patient. Having washed our hands and gowned up, we went through to Brian's ensuite room. His bed was in the centre of this reasonably sized white space. Furnishings were sparse: a chair, a locker and a wardrobe. There was a portable television high on the wall. Surprisingly, I also discovered there was a fridge, which I later found out was donated by the Leukemia Association, so patients could enjoy a cool drink. As being in isolation means never leaving the room, go to the hospital shop or the vending machine. Brian began a regime of blood transfusions and chemotherapy. The day after this started, I again bumped into Paul's friend as we exchanged news on our patients. "She's on life support and they're doing a brain scan," he said. "But they expect to be switching her machine off tomorrow. There seems to be no hope for her." His statement was flat, like it was not possible to actually mean or understand the sentence in any real way. I didn't even want to try to take in what I had heard. I needed to talk to Brian about how we would approach telling people why he was in hospital. It was going to come out by accident somewhere along the line that Brian had leukemia. We talked about this leukemia word that he didn't want to admit to. I advised him that he might as well get used to it. If he didn't want sympathy or attention, not telling his friends the truth would not be the best way to go about it. So we agreed that we would tell people now that his sickness had a name. It was leukemia. We would talk honestly about our situation. Blood transfusions and chemo continued, but Brian was not pain-free within the week as we had been told. This didn't worry me unduly. Surely the terrible pain would be gone by week 2. The doctors thought that Brian's pain could not be as bad as it seemed, so they sent a social worker to talk to him, as though it was all in his mind. I didn't understand how they could possibly imagine that Brian could be pretending to be in such pain day and night. I felt really angry that Brian was having trouble getting morphine when he was trembling in pain. How could anyone be so blind to the obvious distress and disability that was so plain to see? I felt so helpless and frustrated. I felt like I was suddenly living in a parallel world, which of course I was. "We don't like giving morphine freely," a nurse told me. "It isn't about what you like," I said, frustration and desperation in my voice. "It's about keeping Brian out of pain. There is nothing wrong with his head. He has real pain in his body." Brian loved soccer and was full of life. It was difficult to see him so disabled. I felt so much compassion for him and his horrendous pain. He was worried about his hair. Lots of it fell out after the first chemo. I patted his hair dry when he showered and hoped to help him lose less. Watching my now frail, pain-filled son trying to negotiate 2 IV stands while going to the bathroom. One arm had chemo and 1 drip and blood in the second, while the other arm had a drip for fluids and other medications. I could not believe we had come to this. Weeks before, we'd been planning holidays and so forth. Vicky was due to take part in a fashion show and was all excited about her modelling debut. It was an annual 4th-year event where the students run the fashion show, organise everything and do their own modelling. The proceeds always go to charity, and this year the charity was the Leukemia Fund. John had come to the hospital early in the day so I could leave and prepare Vicky. We had makeup, nails and jewellery to sort out. We had to make sure there wasn't a hair astray for that strut down the catwalk. Brian had really enjoyed his experience in the fashion show when he was in 4th year, and he wanted to support Vicky and see her do her thing. He tried so hard to be there on the day. He sat on the side of the bed, grabbed his crutches, and attempted so many times to put his legs under him, but he couldn't. He was exasperated by his weakness, disappointed in himself that he could not force those legs to bear him up. This was one of the very few times that Brian was left alone in the hospital in the evening. We recorded the show for him. He was so proud of Vicky, who had put on such a wonderful show. I was torn between my natural pride and joy in Vicky and the searing pain of leaving my child in hospital in such terrible shape. We could see how concerned the hospital staff were, and we knew that every effort was being made to find a cure. We were advised that the treatment would be delivered on an outpatient basis shortly, once his bloods were okay. It had been expected that he could stay home after a week, but it was more than 2 weeks before Brian was allowed home, and then it was only for a weekend. We were given prescriptions for pain relief and other medications to help him through, but the pain continued at home. His knees and ankles were red and swollen. He used 5 pillows, 1 under each ankle and each knee, and 1 on which to rest his painful and immobile arms. If he turned sideways, he used the pillow between his knees to save them from touching each other. Brian and I were always very close. When we sat down on the couch, I'd practice some metamorphosis with him. This is a healing technique that uses symbols to encourage a positive frame of mind. On other occasions, I would massage his back. We didn't have really deep conversations, as he wasn't a word person, but we had an understanding. It's so confusing when relationships suddenly change, suddenly turn upside down. I'd always enjoyed Brian so much. He was so funny, always light-hearted and enjoyed people. At night time he often cooked up something to eat for himself. A burger and a small pizza in a burger bun, which was one of his favourites. He called it his pizza burger, and he made one for anyone in the house who wanted it. He was carefree and generous, and that didn't really change. He never complained, never worried about himself. His brothers spent all the time they could with him. John, thoughtful and considerate, had come home from college to be with him. Paul never left his side, and Vicky too, though she had a part-time job in Tesco, spent as much time as she could chatting and caring for him, trying to distract him from his pain. Now we were worried sick. We were due back in the hospital on Monday.